Welcome to the debate. Have you ever woken up in a strange hotel room and for like 3 or 4 terrifying seconds, you have absolutely no idea who you are or where you are?
Oh, yeah. Total panic.
Right. There is this profound cognitive void, a feeling of being completely untethered from reality before your memory finally rushes back in to fill the space. Well, today, we are exploring the premise that this void isn't just a, temporary morning glitch.
It is the baseline state of our everyday human existence.
Exactly. We are examining the fundamental nature of what our source text, the fivefold geometry of ascension in the eternal mind, terms the operations of ascension. Specifically, how multidimensional beings navigate reality.
And it is a highly complex architecture, right? We are dealing with 5-dimensional bodies distributed across 4 main dimensions of frequency, vibration, and energy.
Yeah, realms spanning from the underworld and earth all the way to heaven and the heaven beyond the heavens.
Right.
And what is central to our discussion today is how the text distills this massive cosmic process into a very specific clash. It defines the operations of ascension as a debate between two archetypes: the poet who holds all the information in his head, and the romantic poet who has perfected his follies until he has become wise.
Which brings us to the central question.
Right. Is ascension fundamentally a process of informational retrieval to overcome our dimensional amnesia, or is it an experiential, inherently messy process of perfecting human folly into wisdom? I will be arguing that ascension is at its core an informational reclamation. It is represented by the poet with all the information who has to systematically overcome structural amnesia to understand the geometry of reality.
Journey. It is embodied by the romantic poet who cannot just bypass the friction of the third dimension. They have to actually live through and perfect their follies to find true wisdom.
To set the baseline here, the entire predicament of our third-dimensional reality is framed as a structural, informational deficit. The text explicitly states that a veil of amnesia falls upon the mind every time it drops down the dimensions.
We quite literally forget our origins.
Yes, exactly. If we are multidimensional beings, the text suggests we are currently operating with only a fraction of our own data. We fall into what the author terms the upside-down backwards thinking of third-dimensional psychology.
Because that psychology demands hard evidence, right?
Right. It demands hard evidence of a sixth sense. And without it, the third-dimensional mind just completely rejects the idea that an infinite being or eternity could be the source of our reality.
Right. It needs proof.
So ascension has to be the act of the poet with all the information. It is the intellectual, geometric reclamation of the precise data of our infinite nature. If you do not retrieve the map, you just stay lost in the upside-down thinking.
Okay, but let's look closer at the language the text actually uses to describe the operations of ascension, because it does not read like a quiet, moment of data retrieval.
Well, no, it is intense.
It uses visceral, incredibly intense phrasing. The ascension process is framed as an unstoppable force on a collision course with an immovable object. It is described as a psychic cramp.
A cramp of paradigms, yes.
Right. Driven by the fierce debate between religion and superstition on one side and science and rationality on the other, gathering cosmic data is entirely insufficient to resolve this. You have to actually live through the friction of the third dimension.
But the friction comes from the lack of data.
I disagree. The true engine of ascension is the romantic poet, because this archetype leans into the contradictions. They make mistakes, and they perfect those earthly follies until they transmute into wisdom. The text builds toward a profound ultimatum that we are either all saved or none by giving all to all.
Right.
You simply cannot logic your way into that kind of moral surrender. You have to endure it.
Okay, let's pause right there, because we really need to explain the mechanics of this amnesia before we can decide how to cure it. If you are listening to this and wondering how a veil of amnesia actually works mechanically across dimensions, think about the specific locations the text provides.
Right, the physical locations for our higher and lower states.
Yes. It states that our fifth-dimensional home of heaven is located perfectly within the breath. And our first-dimensional connection to God, that ageless body and timeless mind, is accessed during sleep.
Right, because the text positions sleep as a singularity, a point of pure existence, stripped of time and space, which is why it aligns with the first dimension.
Exactly, and it positions breath as the rhythm connecting the physical to the non-physical, aligning with the fifth dimension. So let me offer an analogy here.
Go for it.
Think of the multidimensional mind as a grand sweeping symphony. Right now, in the third dimension, our psychological worldview is like a listener who can only hear a single out-of-tune instrument playing in the foreground.
Okay.
They are completely deaf to the deep, steady bass line of the first-dimensional sleep, and they are ignoring the soaring strings of the fifth-dimensional breath.
But the rest of the orchestra is still playing.
Exactly. We still breathe. We still sleep. The data of our higher and lower dimensions hasn't been destroyed. It is just blocked from our conscious awareness.
Right.
So ascension is the act of the poet with all the information suddenly recognizing the entire score. It is an informational expansion of awareness, recognizing the teachings of the tongue of birds, right? That elevated, structural language from above that reveals the whole composition. You do not need to suffer the out-of-tune instrument to ascend. You just need to realize the symphony is playing.
I see where you are going with that. But the out-of-tune instrument isn't just an illusion to be ignored. It is the very instrument you have been assigned to play.
But it is out of tune.
Sure.
But your symphony analogy assumes that the third dimension
Is merely a waiting room, or like a sensory deprivation tank that we need to escape by accessing a higher frequency. The text doesn't support that kind of bypass
How does it not? It literally calls it upside-down backwards thinking.
because it links this amnesia directly to the third dimension of time and space. The psychological worldview demanding evidence isn't merely an error in calculation. It is a fundamental necessary condition of experiencing this specific realm of existence.
A condition we are supposed to cure?
If the amnesia were just a block in awareness, a simple shift in perspective would resolve it. But the text describes the resolution as a psychic cramp.
Why must it be a cramp, though, if the information of the fifth dimension is literally as close as our next breath?
Because you cannot force a third-dimensional mind to simply accept a fifth-dimensional reality without causing massive psychological friction. When you are operating in time and space, the errors you are talking about, that upside-down backwards thinking, those are lived experiences.
They are lived errors.
Yes, but the reliance on science and rationality versus religion and superstition are follies of the human condition. You use the phrase, the tongue of birds, to describe the elevated structural map.
Right, the poet's language.
But what about the teachings of the tongue of beasts, the grounded, visceral, instinctual reality of surviving on Earth and in the underworld?
That is precisely what the romantic poet gets trapped in.
No, the romantic poet is operating on the tongue of beasts intentionally. He doesn't just zoom out to see the musical score. He perfects his follies in the mud. The text specifically says the romantic poet perfects his follies until he becomes wise.
Right, until he is wise.
Yes, and perfection implies a grueling process of refinement through lived tension, not a sudden download of the symphony sheet music.
Okay, but the psychic cramp you were talking about, this tension of an unstoppable force hitting an immovable object, only exists because of the informational deficit.
You think it is just a lack of data?
Completely. The clash between science and rationality versus religion and superstition is just a symptom of profound blindness. Both of those paradigms are trapped in upside-down thinking.
Trapped, yes.
Science looks only for physical causes, and superstition projects physical fears onto the divine. The text states that both sides are needing to see beyond its own decisions.
Exactly. They need to see beyond.
And why do they need to see beyond? Because the third-dimensional mind lacks the data of the other dimensional bodies. Psychology fails to see eternity as the source of stability exactly because it operates on an incomplete dataset.
Okay, I follow your logic.
So the comprehensive knowledge of the poet, with all the information, the tongue of birds, is the only thing that can elevate the mind above that clash.
But the text literally defines the operations of ascension as this clash. It says, quote, "In the operations of ascension, do these two worldviews clash?"
Right, it is a debate.
The experiential tension isn't a barrier to ascension, it is the vehicle of it. If we had all the information from the jump, there would be no unstoppable force.
Well, sure.
Or if we could simply bypass the friction by intellectually recognizing the geometric coordinates of our 5D breath and 1D sleep, there would be no immovable object. Intellectual mapping alone cannot move an immovable object.
So what does?
It takes the gravity of lived human experience, the weight of time and space, to generate the friction required for true wisdom.
We have to look at the phrasing, though. Upside down backwards thinking. That implies a correct right side up way of thinking actually exists.
Sure, a structural truth.
Yes, an objective structural truth that the psychological worldview is entirely missing. If you do not know that the fifth dimension of heaven is quite literally in your breath, no amount of romantic suffering in the third dimension is going to organically teach you that specific geometric reality.
You do not need the geometry if you have the wisdom.
Oh, I strongly disagree. You could perfect your follies for 1,000 lifetimes, but unless you grasp the actual layout of the underworld, the earth, heaven, and the heaven beyond heavens, you are just wandering elegantly in the dark.
Wandering elegantly, that is a good line.
Thank you, but it is true. The romantic poet's journey only results in ascension if there is a true informational framework governing the universe.
Even if we grant that the architectural map is objectively real, knowing the map is vastly different from walking the territory. And this leads us directly to the outcome of this immense tension.
The ultimatum.
Exactly. What is the actual destination of this clash? The text drives us toward a highly specific, radical resolution. It states that this debate leads to the ultimatum, that we are either all saved or none by giving all to have all.
A massive statement.
Think about the magnitude of that. That is not a logical deduction you make by staring at a map. That is a radical, moral, and experiential surrender.
Let's unpack the mechanics of that surrender, though. Why do you view all saved or none as an experiential necessity rather than a structural one?
Because giving all to have all, completely defies rational, third-dimensional accumulation of data.
How so?
To the rational mind, the mind looking for evidence and stability, the mind prioritizing self-preservation in time and space, giving everything away to secure collective salvation is absurd. It is the ultimate folly.
Well, to a 3D mind, yes.
Right. But the romantic poet, through the psychic cramp of living in the third dimension, transmutes that absurdity into profound, unified wisdom. An informational poet, merely cataloging dimensional frequencies and locating sleep as the first dimension, doesn't inherently arrive at the necessity of universal sacrifice.
They do if the map dictates it.
No. Only someone who has intimately experienced the pain, the limits, and the deep interconnection of the third dimension recognizes that individual ascension is impossible without collective salvation. It requires the tongue of beasts, the visceral understanding of the pack, the flock, the shared suffering of the earth.
Okay, but if ascension were purely about perfecting experiential follies and arriving at an emotional, poetic surrender, why does the source strictly predicate this entire journey on a rigid fivefold geometry?
It is the staging ground.
It is more than a staging ground. The author doesn't just tell us to go live, make mistakes, and love each other. The author provides a hyper-specific, systematic map of reality. 5-dimensional bodies distributed across 4 main dimensions.
Including the specific frequencies and vibrations.
Yes, exactly. The energy realms. The ultimatum that we are all saved or none isn't just a beautiful moral sentiment about sharing, it is a mathematical inevitability of our multidimensional architecture.
Okay, wait, how does a mathematical framework mandate a moral surrender, though?
Because of the nature of the dimensional bodies. If we truly possess 5 known dimensional bodies spread across these realms, then at our highest dimensions, the heaven beyond heavens, we are quite literally undivided.
Right, the unity of the upper dimensions.
Yes. The veil of amnesia creates the illusion of separation in the third dimension. Therefore, the all saved or none ultimatum is a statement of structural fact. You cannot ascend an individual piece of a completely interconnected, multidimensional geometric network.
I see what you are saying.
If you pull one node, the whole web has to come with it. The romantic poet's wisdom is entirely dependent on the structural truth of the informational poet's cosmic map. Furthermore, the text itself states at the very end, quote, "The operations of ascension is nothing but the poet with all of the information in his head, debating the romantic poet who has perfected his follies."
Yes, debating.
The operation is the debate. The geometric information is positioned as exactly equal in weight to the experiential wisdom.
They are positioned as equals in the debate, yes. But look at the trajectory of the mind in the text. The mind falls down the dimensions.
The veil descends.
Exactly. The veil of amnesia descends. We find ourselves in the third dimension, engaging in this upside-down backwards thinking. The entire movement of reality is a descent into experience.
A descent into forgetfulness.
But if the goal was simply to hold the geometric information, the fall into the third dimension would be nothing more than a cosmic mistake, a glitch in the eternal mind.
Well, it is an amnesia.
But the tension of the immovable object and the unstoppable force suggests a profound purpose. The first-dimensional timeless mind in our sleep and the fifth-dimensional heaven in our breath are always there, running in the background. But they are brought into harmony through the friction of the third dimension.
Through resolving the clash.
Right. The romantic poet doesn't reject the third dimension, he perfects it. He uses the heavy, dense materials of earth and the underworld to forge a wisdom that didn't exist in the unblemished perfection of the heaven beyond heavens.
But he can only perfect the third dimension by recognizing the amnesia for what it is. Let's look at the clash of paradigms again, science versus superstition.
Okay.
The text explicitly tells us that the tension, the psychic cramp, is the friction of the infinite mind realizing it has been confined to a finite paradigm.
The immovable object.
Yes, the psychological worldview is desperate for evidence of a sixth sense because it is completely disconnected from the knowledge of its own first and fifth dimensional realities. When the poet with all the information injects the awareness of the eternal mind into the third dimensional space, that is when the amnesia begins to shatter.
I am not denying the map shatters the illusion.
Right, the structural reclamation of our true nature, the tongue of birds speaking into the dense third dimension. That is what allows the romantic poet to suddenly recognize that his third-dimensional follies were just that, follies born of upside-down thinking.
But they had to be lived.
Without the poet of information, the romantic poet just keeps repeating the same earthly mistakes endlessly.
And without the romantic poet, the poet of information is just an archivist standing in a burning building, holding a blueprint, completely unable to put out the fire.
Okay, that is a bit dramatic.
But it is true. The map of the fivefold geometry might show you where the water is, but it is the messy, lived experience that forces you to realize you are actually thirsty.
I still maintain it is a data issue.
You argue that the clash between science and superstition is just a symptom of missing data. I argue that the clash is the fundamental mechanism of growth. Both worldviews are trapped, needing to see beyond their own decisions.
Because they're upside down.
The science side is trapped by its demand for empirical third-dimensional evidence. The superstition side is trapped by its blind, fearful projection. Giving them a map of the heavens doesn't magically dissolve their stubbornness.
It gives them context.
But they have to collide. They have to experience the failure of their own limited paradigms to solve the psychic cramp. Only when the folly of their stubbornness reaches its absolute limit do they break open into wisdom.
Well, if we follow that logic, the geometric structure of the dimensions is almost incidental to the psychological journey.
Not incidental, foundational. But a foundation is meant to be built upon, not just studied. The architecture of the underworld, earth, and the heavens provides the necessary parameters for the collision.
Okay.
The third dimension is the crucible, where the map is actually tested and made real through lived experience.
Well, then let's summarize where these two paths ultimately leave us. From the perspective of the informational reclamation, the text clearly illustrates that ascension requires overcoming the third dimension's backwards thinking by explicitly reclaiming the multidimensional data of our true nature.
Right. The map.
Exactly. We have to intellectually map our fifth-dimensional breath and our first-dimensional connection to God in sleep. We have to recognize that the ultimatum of collective salvation is a structural reality of our interconnected bodies.
This is the elevated domain of the poet with all the information.
And from the experiential perspective, the journey is ultimately about enduring the necessary psychic cramp of conflicting worldviews, the amnesia, the demand for evidence, and the intense friction of time and space aren't just software bugs to be fixed with a better map.
You think they are features?
They are the required medium through which we perfect human folly into the wisdom of universal salvation. The descent into the third dimension has a purpose, and fulfilling that purpose is the messy, lived domain of the romantic poet.
What we undeniably converge on, however, is that the text positions the operations of ascension not as a peaceful, passive state of meditation. It is an intense, almost violent collision of paradigms.
Absolutely. The clash between science and superstition, the unstoppable force and the immovable object.
Right, it requires us to profoundly confront our existence beyond standard third-dimensional time and space.
The ascension process is not for the faint of heart, that is for sure.
Definitely not.
Whether it is a rigorous geometric reclamation of lost cosmic data, or the grueling transmutation of human folly into moral surrender, it demands that we face the severe limitations of our everyday psychological worldview. The architecture of reality is vast, spanning from the underworld to the heaven beyond heavens, and how we navigate it speaks deeply to the fundamental nature of the mind.
It leaves us with a profound dichotomy to consider. Does true ascension require the structural clarity of the tongue of birds or the grounded experiential survival of the tongue of beasts? Are we the poet of structured cosmic information or the romantic poet of perfected experiential wisdom?
I guess we have to leave that to the listener.
Exactly. The next time you wake up in an unfamiliar room, grappling with that brief, terrifying cognitive void of amnesia before your reality rushes back in, ask yourself, are you just trying to remember your name, or are you finally trying to remember your dimension?